Good afternoon, and welcome to today's discussion, Disarming Disinformation. Today's program is sponsored by the Communicators team at the National Press Club, the place where news happens. I'm John Perino, a member of the team and a senior associate at the Glen Echo Group, where we specialize in communications for technology policy issues. Today's program is the second event in a series of critical conversations on what we're referring to as dark PR. Our first session focused on disinformation for hire, and today we'll discuss how to counter influence operations, particularly as communicators and journalists. Today's conversation is also happening just about an hour before a House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence hearing on stopping the spread of disinformation. The second presidential debate was scheduled for tonight. Election day is just 18 days away. While disinformation is often tied to politics, campaigns, and elections, however, the issue is much deeper and broader. We'll get into that shortly, but first, some quick housekeeping. This event is being recorded and will be made available on the National Press Club website. That's press.org. We encourage you to submit questions using the Q&A chat tool in Zoom, and we'll answer as many of them as possible during this conversation. Finally, the Press Club event hashtag is NPC Live. We're fortunate to have a phenomenal group of speakers. They're coming to us from across the US today for this discussion. First, we have Dipayan Ghosh. He's co-director of the Digital Platforms and Democracy Project at Harvard's Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy. He's also author of Terms of Disservice, How Silicon Valley is Destructive by Design. And he previously served as a senior advisor at Facebook and in the Obama Lighthouse. Lisa Kaplan founded Althea Group to help organizations navigate the new digital reality and protect themselves against disinformation. She served as digital director for Senator Angus King's re-election campaign in 2018, where she designed and executed a proactive and defensive digital strategy to identify, understand, and respond to disinformation campaigns. And we have Garland Stancil. He has more than 32 years of experience in public relations, marketing, health promotion, advocacy, and fundraising. He serves as chair of the Public Relations Society of America, we know it as PRSA, and is chief communications officer at Children's of Alabama, ranked among the best pediatric centers in the nation. Thank you all for joining us today. My first question for all of you is when your internal alarm went off about disinformation campaigns. And I'd like to start with Dipayan on that.
For me, I think it was as I was working at Facebook, which I left the company in 2017, but in the couple of years prior to that, it really struck me as a company that was certainly at the center of the media ecosystem in many ways, but also participant in our consumption of news, of course, and I think increasingly during my time there, I felt really that Facebook was not really just a platform, that it was increasingly becoming a sort of editor, in the sense that it determines what it presumes about us based on our information, and then based on our personal information and those behavioral profiles, channels topics at us, channels news articles and posts from various public figures and our friends and so on and so forth. It determines what we see over the platform. Meanwhile, it's become the dominant platform that we use to consume media content as a general matter. And when you have that combination of a firm that's central in the context of our media ecosystem and determining everything that we see over that dominant platform, I think we've reached a stage where we need to start thinking a little bit harder about how to put more public interest into the consideration of what we see. And for me, this really came alive in the context of the 2016 campaign. I was working at the company at the time, and obviously was very closely following and supporting the Hillary campaign. I think what struck me was that there were instances where the company could have just done better and put democratic interests over profits, and chose not to do that.
Now, Lisa, I want to turn to you with the same question, and when your internal alarm went off about disinformation.
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think like most Americans, I first became aware of this as a systemic issue and a challenge for us in terms of both being information consumers, but also people who are trying to communicate right around the 2016 election. I would say it became very real for me though, through my experience working on the campaign. That was a very informative experience because frankly, a function of timing. It was the first campaign since 2016. And at that point, I think we were still primarily talking about disinformation as being a political issue, when in reality, it's a national security issue. So one of the interesting points of being on an independent campaign is we were able to see disinformation, both foreign and domestic, coming from the left and the right. So I think that really shaped my thinking around this issue. As for alarm bells, that sort of thing, I mean, nothing prepares you for being targeted by a disinformation campaign until you are targeted by a disinformation campaign. So I can't go into a ton of detail on that, but I would say it is the type of thing that it is the type of thing that we need to really stay on top of and closely monitor, because from my perspective right now, we have not made any of the systemic or structural changes that need to be considered and implement in order to right the ship. Right now, we're continuing to go down the same trajectory, referencing, as was already referenced, with the algorithms controlling the information that we see, and the fact that those are so easily exploitable. And it's very different, I think, topic to topic, and we need to start having serious conversations. So now I have different alarm bells going off than I used to. Now the alarm bells are, okay, well, we know that Facebook is doing things like connecting people who appear to be interested in the environment, who appear to be interested in gardening, so that they can be shown local meetup groups to go hiking or something like that in their community. But what happens when it takes people who have shown that they're interested in white supremacy and neo-Nazism and violence and connects them and algorithmically suggests the pages that they could potentially be following to meet each other? And so these are the conversations that we need to really start having in earnest yesterday. And those are, I would say, the current alarm bells that should be going off for all of us.
Now, Garland, I'll turn to you for that communications perspective. As a communications leader, disinformation's always been there, but there's a lot of new things happening. When did you start to see this dark side?
Right. And as you said, it has always been there. And my day job, as you said, is in healthcare. So even back in the 90s, we were seeing misinformation. We have seen misinformation around health diagnoses and things from our bird flu to swine flu to Ebola. Anytime there's an outbreak of that type, plenty of misinformation. I think what we are seeing different now is, in conjunction with misinformation, the disinformation and malinformation that is part of dark communication and dark PR, where it is intentional and there are attacks. As far as an alarm bell, I would agree with Lisa and Dipayan that it was in 2016, during the 2016 election, that from a communication standpoint, you start seeing, okay, well, this is a different world. We've had misinformation before, but now we've got intentional sabotage and intentional information that goes beyond misinformation to that, planted disinformation and malinformation. That was throughout 2016 and proliferated in the fourth quarter of 2016. And then it has continued to grow, in years since then, and in the first year of the current administration. And then we've seen it again this year with the pandemic. and all that's been around that and misinformation, disinformation that was out there, especially within the first part of it. But since then, it continuing, still, dark PR and disinformation around the social injustice that we, were seeing and they're still seeing in May, June, July, and on to now, and in the current election cycle.
Now I'm going to turn to you each one at a time again for this next question. A lot of people think that maybe they can't be persuaded by disinformation. They'll know it when they see it. Let's talk about how far the ramifications of disinformation really go. So Lisa, I'd like to start with you first for this one. I know in your current business at Althea, you work not only with governments, but also with a variety of firms. What are the ramifications of this?
Yeah, so anytime anybody ever says that disinformation works or doesn't work, or that it's not effective, I always ask them, why do people spend resources on it? Like, this is now a line item in over 70 countries' military budgets. So it works, trust me. The way disinformation works is it targets our biases, and we all have biases. We're all human beings. And so it typically targets strong emotions because it's trying to seek an emotional response. So I always like to use the example of coronavirus when we have this discussion, because people literally live and die based on the information that they're getting about how to effectively protect themselves from the virus and from contracting the virus, spreading it to their friends and family and their communities. So when you think about disinformation then, and I want us to think back to March, because we didn't really know what was happening. We didn't really have any idea how it was being spread. Should we wipe down our groceries? Are we going to be able to buy toilet paper? Are we going to be able to, leave our homes, see our friends and families? What does all of this mean? We knew nothing. And an information vacuum is where disinformation and bad actors thrive. And so it really depends on the motivations of the actor. But if you panic bought anything, and I'm going to say I stocked up on, paper goods, got extra pasta, all of that stuff, because who knows, you fell for disinformation. And so I think that is something to realize, is that it does affect all of us. Think about miracle cures too. We saw a lot of miracle cures going around. And again, they were designed to not necessarily target fear, but to provide hope, which is another powerful motivator. And so with that, what we saw was a lot of, if you drink water every 30 minutes, you're not going to contract the virus, which is total nonsense garbage. And so, but at the time we didn't know. And so this is the type of thing that was being shared. So disinformation, it does feed on our biases. It tries to target those strong emotions. And then the last thing is the messenger really matters. So disinformation really depends on misinformation. The two are linked. And so a bad actor is depending on you to spread these falsehoods to your communities, online, to other, whether you're sharing a bad news article or you're simply hitting forward on a junk email that contains no truth about the virus. It means that it's depending on you in order to do that, because your network, and when I say your network, I mean, if you are a social media influencer, yes, but also your friends and family trust you. Just one note on that, that's also a pretty powerful thing to realize, because it means that you can help stop the spread of disinformation by not sharing it. So whenever you see something that is targeting your biases, that is trying to elicit a strong emotion, always ask yourself if you're being targeted, and read your social media feeds critically the way you would, say, a newspaper or something of that nature, because it's the passive consumption of media. It's the desire to share these clickbaity articles. It's fun. Just if we all are smarter about how we share content, we could do a lot of good in the world.
Garland, I'm going to go to you next. You've written about the infodemic a bit. You work in healthcare. Seems to be very real ramifications there.
Right, exactly. And as I mentioned earlier, there was a lot of misinformation early on, as Lisa just mentioned, with the pandemic. And PRSA quickly decided that we needed to get out there some information to our members and to the community, and developed an infodemic graphic that we sent out saying, you know, you owe it to yourself and to those you love and your communities to check the information, to make sure, you know, where is the source, make sure it's from a reputable source. And, you know, even to this day, we are still hearing challenges to reputable sources, whether that's the World Health Organization or, you know, other groups that are giving out information. And so as communicators, we owe it to ourselves and those who listen to us to check those sources, and not just check them once, but check them frequently, almost every day and multiple times a day, and make sure that the information is the most current information. And one of the things that happened early on from a communication standpoint is that things were happening quickly. And as Lisa just said, we didn't know what we didn't know. And so information was coming out, and the best information, the best advice that was being given by the CDC or World Health Organization or Dr. Fauci or others was the best information we had at the time. And as we found out more, then that may change somewhat. That didn't mean that that information that was provided before was wrong. It just meant that that's as much as we knew at the time, and we were making the best decisions we could based on what we knew. And as things began to unfold, then you know, those things would change. And I'll go back to what Lisa was saying too. We're certainly in a time, not just in healthcare in the current pandemic, but at least in my lifetime, we are a more polarized society, certainly in the US and globally to some extent. And there's such divide and partisan divide and ideological divides, not just politics, but on morals, on medicine, on everything that touches our lives. And so when the misinformation, disinformation is out there, and especially on social media, many times the people, they may suspect that it's not legitimate information, but they're happy to share it, and they don't want to question it because it does support their biases, you know, their bias they already have. So those biases, people are looking to share the information that already supports their belief or their side, and they're not as concerned. So from a communication perspective, it's incumbent on us to help to shed light on that and bring that those dark messages to the light, and to say this is, you know, this is not true, and to call those out when it's appropriate. So you know, we're kind of in a strange place where many people cannot discern the difference between the truth and malinformation, and many people maybe who could do a better job of it just simply don't want to because it doesn't support their own personal belief.
Now, Dipayan, I'm gonna make this question even more difficult for you. You were inside the White House, inside Facebook, now sitting in academia. What is the worst case scenario that this disinformation could have for the American public?
Well, you know, I think let me first say that what Lisa and Garland are suggesting is exactly right. That first of all, there are so many different kinds of categories of information that we might be talking about, where, you know, misleading content, falsehoods, etc. It all has an impact on the media ecosystem, especially, and I find personally most dangerous, the use of half-truths. The pushing, the dissemination of half-truths, either as organic content or as targeted political advertising, that can really start to ignite a rumor or a suggestion or a way of thinking in certain pockets of the American voting population. That, I think, is the most dangerous thing. And it's it's so effective, as Lisa was suggesting in the first part of her comments. It's so effective, and the best evidence of that is that both bad actors and political campaigns keep on pouring their money into this set of practices. That's to say, targeted dissemination of disinformation, either paid or organically. And it's this whole infrastructure that that companies like Facebook have over time essentially created, where essentially a bad actor or a campaign, anyone that can kind of meet this barrier, reach this bar of getting approved by Facebook to own a page and perhaps even push an ad, pay to push an ad or content on that page to a targeted community, can start to pick out those 1,000 voters in Manhattan and those 1,000 people in El Paso and that pocket of voters in San Francisco, that they think, that the campaign thinks will find the content, the misinformation or disinformation that the campaign or the bad actor is looking to push. Those pockets will find that engaging, and for dollars on the dime, for dimes on the dollar, you get this very cost-effective means of pushing a trope, and people then tweet it and retweet it and repost it and engage with it, and it very often we've seen this time and time again. Very often, this kind of content starts to just kind of take off. And to that end, researchers at MIT have found that that falsehoods travel much further and faster than the truth. And I think I would add on to that and suggest that it's particularly because of this kind of commercial regime that's been set up by dominant social media platforms that enables falsehood to get disseminated by bad actors and frankly, political campaigns that should know better or should at least do better to take advantage of this whole system.
Thank you all. I'm going to open up a quick audience poll. And as that poll opens up, I want to circle back to Lisa quickly to talk about this idea of half-truths and how that can really go horribly wrong.
Yeah, so I want to talk a little bit about half-truths as it relates to conspiracy theories, because I think that we need to start taking those much more seriously as well. And I'm going to talk a little bit about QAnon. So for those of you who aren't familiar, QAnon is this amorphous sort of group. It started being as being much more contained, I would say, and fringy, in that there was this figure called Q who would drop little pieces of information called a Q drop onto a message board. And the interesting thing about QAnon is it's really taken on a life of its own. I refer to it as the Chopped of conspiracy theories, because it'll say things like the information that comes out from this Q character, it's just random things that don't always go together. So it'll be like James Bond, Deep State, Tom Hanks, and there's this conspiracy theory that there is this deep state that is essentially controlling all of the decisions that are being made by government. It is particularly interesting because it really takes advantage of those half-truths. So it will say that there were individuals who were part of the Obama administration who are not supportive of President Trump's policies, and that is true. What is not true is there isn't some sort of undue influence into this alleged deep state that is controlling Hollywood and every economic sector in our country and all of these things, and trafficking children. And so as it relates to these half-truths, we also have to think about, why is it that people are attracted to this? And a lot of that has to do, again, going back to their own biases. Typically people who join these sorts of movements or conspiracies, they are They are people who feel like they have been left behind. They are people who are looking for answers. They are people who are looking to be part of a community. And QAnon, because it has a sort of find your own evidence, draw your own conclusions, it's very broadly appealing because it means that folks can just make any assumptions and conclusions that they want in order to explain their own situation. It almost has this cult-like or like religious dynamic. I raise that because it's now become a very serious threat to brands, for example. It's become a serious threat to our ability to communicate. And these are the types of groups that we need to be thinking about when we're thinking about disinformation. So for example, earlier this summer, Wayfair was targeted by QAnon, who likes to accuse people of being, of essentially trafficking children, which is not true. But what happened was, essentially, and all of this, by the way, happened before this example went, and I try not to use this term, but viral, and the notion of QAnon and Wayfair all of a sudden being linked happened. And that happened in early July. A few weeks earlier, in late June, this conspiracy started percolating on the fringier sides of the internet. And so we were seeing content that would say, or we went back and did a case study, and we saw some content about, how to, or accusing Wayfair of child trafficking. And the alleged evidence was that all of the furniture was named after, or had people's names who were also the names of missing persons. And thus, according to QAnon, Wayfair was actually trafficking children in the furniture. That is, of course, absurd. However, because it feeds into this broader desire to be able to point out how corporate America may be conducting illicit behavior, and that's why they're making money, that sort of thing. It's now part of the QAnon doctrine, and that's dangerous. People had their home addresses posted. The headquarters of Wayfair in Boston was posted online. There are some serious offline ramifications for this. So what's the lesson? The lesson is, with disinformation, you have to look for things that are going to affect your organization, your company, your brand early. And we're not talking about using meltwater and doing reports about what's trending on Twitter, because by the time that happens, you've lost most of your response options. We're talking about really early detection, catching disinformation when it starts, because people who, like, basically disinformation only works if people see it, believe it, and change their behavior. There's a bad actor who's out there trying to cause an action. And so that early detection piece is what we at Alethea Group recommend to all of our clients. So that's one thing that you can do today, is start going out and looking for instances of disinformation and misinformation early. Because if you catch it before it becomes a problem, you'll have more options about how you want to act, instead of letting, whatever's trending on Twitter and whatever is being printed in the news dictate your decisions.
Now we have our survey results back in, and a little more than half of you believe that you're at risk of falling for disinformation online. Nearly a third of attendees have had their organization been the target of disinformation, but less than only a quarter of you have a plan for countering disinformation. Garland, I want to turn to you. With healthcare misinformation rampant, what do you do to respond to that?
It's a good question, and as Lisa just said, plan, and you were just saying that less than a quarter said they had a plan, and that's really number one. Those of us who are in communication typically have crisis communication plans. There are times when we used to say we had that plan in the drawer. We have it in the electronic drawer now, and but plans for many things. So whatever your industry is, if you are in a power industry, you may have a plan for if there's a nuclear explosion. If you're in healthcare, you may have a plan for if you have a staff member who goes awry and hurts patients. You may have a plan if there is an active shooter in your facility. So in the same way, it is critically important that you think about information, dark PR, and having a plan for that. The time to plan is not in the moment, but to look at, okay, given, am I in politics? Am I in healthcare? Am I in financial services? Whatever your company is, if you're environmental, where are your vulnerabilities? And where do you need to plan and have that plan? And go ahead and be thinking through, if there is some truth, we're talking about half-truths. Many times the reason misinformation and dark PR is effective is because there is some truth in it. There is some truth, but it's a half-truth. So if there is some truth to that attack, take action right away as quickly as you can to apologize, make things right, come out with your information. And if you have a plan, then you already should have some message points that you're going to come out there with and say, here's the way we're addressing this. In the midst of this, just like any other crisis, it's not the time to start, pointing fingers or having blame, but try to take responsibility and don't try to make yourself look like the victim. So a plan, I can't emphasize enough, is very important. And quick response. I think staying calm, having a positive attitude, try to think through so you're not aggravating the situation and that your response is not causing more doubt, more fear, being timely and transparent. And then back to accurate information, conveying the most accurate information and adhering to ethical standards. And if you are an organization, a company, a person, and you have built your business, built your brand on ethics and ethical standards, that will go a long way to whether people are believing your messages and believing that what you're saying is true. If you have not done that and you've had your ethics and your standards at question, that's going to make it much more difficult. So that's, I will say, number one, have a plan, be able to respond quickly, honestly, and ethically.
Now, I'm going to turn back quickly to Lisa on this. You emphasize the importance of being proactive and identifying disinformation before it really starts to spread. Where do you start with that? How do you get out ahead?
So that's what our firm does. So we detect and mitigate instances of disinformation and misinformation with an emphasis on being able to uncover the information flows. It's a highly technical exercise. We use anything that can be found on the open web. So it truly is, for those of you who have a government background, it's essentially open source intelligence. And what we do is we uncover how the information is flowing, where narratives originated, who is behind them, state actors, non-state actors. Guy in his basement is the proverbial one that we always hear. We can do that too. But the purpose is to be able to catch it early. So how we do that is through a mix of, the technologies that we've built, and also through the being able to access the right data feeds. I typically recommend, and one of the things that we do is we look at what we call off major social media platforms. People aren't seeding their narratives necessarily on Twitter and Facebook anymore. It relies, going back to the relationship between disinformation and misinformation, it relies on users to move it there. That being said, we also recommend that people take an impact-based approach. So if disinformation only matters if people see it, believe it, and change their behavior, I don't stay up at night over things that I know are never going to work. They're never going to gain traction. We have the data to prove it. So I would say the first thing to do would be really to get the advanced analytic capabilities to understand the landscape, because without those insights, you can't make smart decisions.
Now, Dipayan, I'm going to give you another difficult question, because you're the computer scientist here, you're a lawyer. From a platform perspective and also from a regulatory perspective, there's this gray area of what actually is misinformation versus disinformation and half-truths. How can we start to identify these differences? Does it matter? And what are the potential ways that platforms and government can step in here?
Well, I work with the Miami Herald and other journalistic organizations to help them sort through some of these kinds of things as they come up. The Herald is doing something very interesting in trying to set up a platform to help Florida residents primarily to sort through this mess of information, half-truths, disinformation, as well as truth, of course, in the lead up to the election. I think there have been a lot of different frameworks that different researchers have been putting together over recent years around misleading information, misinformation, disinformation, malinformation. The taxonomies that people have been using are largely arbitrary. I'm not saying that they're not reasonable, they don't make sense, but what I mean is that it depends on which expert, which researcher, which firm you're speaking with to understand how they look at these kinds of issues. But typically, at a very high level, of course, disinformation carries intent. Half-truths are essentially, as Garland was suggesting earlier, have some truth to them, but are often used in a way to kind of push a narrative against the other side. And of course, there's a lot of overlap with misinformation. But all that's to say that taxonomies are taxonomies, and everyone has somewhat arbitrarily developed their own, which, so long as they're transparent about how they approach these kinds of issues and enforce that taxonomy, whether they're a firm or a journalistic organization or whatever it might be, I think that's a fair and reasonable approach. I would suggest that just to be a little cynical about the earlier discussion, I think for organizations, for firms, yes, it makes sense, completely makes sense for them to do whatever they can to focus on high quality journalism, to call out fake news, to develop resources to try to combat fake news, and so on. And yet we also have to recognize we live in an ecosystem now where we have certain power to do something, but we also lack a lot of power in really holding the companies that have established this media ecosystem for us accountable to the public. And we need to do more about that as well. But I'll leave it there for now.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I want to turn back to Garland with that. PRSA, of course, is well known for a code of ethics for the communications industry. I'm sure that there are firms that are members, and probably a lot of firms that are not members of PRSA, who don't adhere to those ethics when it comes to disinformation. How much can ethics help? And what kind of ethics do you hope that the communications industry adheres to when it comes to this?
Right, and thank you, John. The PRSA does have a code of ethics, and we often hear from our members that it's the number one benefit that our members find useful and that they value is that code of ethics. So I would say that the largest percentage of our members adhere to that code of ethics. They commit to uphold that code of ethics, and looking at advocating for the profession, advocating for the code, which underscores honesty and having honesty in all of your dealings, in your communication, your dealings, expertise in representing your company, your clients, your organization with expertise, and knowing that expertise for your particular industry or topic that you're working with, and independence, loyalty, and fairness, and looking at that sometimes if you are a communicator and your company is advocating for something that is not right, that you may have to stand up for that, that there's a time when you are loyal to the client and you are loyal to your company, but that if it's calling you to do something that is unethical, that may be the point where you need to part ways or question or advise your client or company to do something different. I've often said and that what is legal is not always what is ethical, and many times communicators and companies will stop at what is legal. They don't want to do anything illegal, but they may be doing something unethical. And I believe that as communicators, whether we are in marketing, public relations, strategic communication, journalism, whatever you want to call it, we are the conscience of our companies and the conscience of our society, to be able to hold those things up and to challenge those things when there may be something that's unethical, or someone is saying that we should share a half-truth, or if someone at a company or a member of our organizations, whether it's PRSA or a member of your company, wants to engage in dark PR and dark communications, to hold that up and say, no, this is not right. This is not the way we operate. And we base our responses, the way that we practice communication in our code of ethics. And that has to also be something that you hold personally, in your own personal ethics. And we were speaking earlier about your biases, and looking at, and there are different biases, whether they're your inherent biases, your conscious biases, and many that we have that are our unconscious biases, which are controlling things that maybe we don't stop to think about from our background, from the way we were raised, from the part of the country we're raised in, or the part of the world that we're in. And so there's so many things that go into those unconscious biases that sometimes we need to challenge. And if we're talking about ethics, the best place to start is with your personal ethics, and making sure that you know what your personal ethics are, and where is the line that you're going to draw that in a given situation. So in the same way I was talking about a communication plan earlier, you need a plan yourself, so that when you're faced with an ethical dilemma, it's not the first time you've thought about it. And you can say, okay, well, I thought about this, and this is the way, this is what I believe about it. So I'll stop there.
So last week, Facebook actually banned a company, the marketing firm Rally Forge, that was paying people to put out misinformation, or I think in this case we could safely call it disinformation. Is that an action that PRSA should call out if a member did that? Is there industry self-policing beyond ethics here, Garland?
We do have our Board of Ethics and Professional Standards, and that board is thought leaders publishing material, looking at material. There was a time, probably 20 years ago or more, that the Board of Ethics and Professional Standards also was more of a policing type committee, and looked at any of those that might be bad actors. And so the decision was made probably 20 years ago or more that that was not PRSA's role, was to, and not our Board of Ethics and Professional Standards role, to police those members. That said, through our thought leadership and through our code of ethics, we do strongly share those and ask people to adhere to those. We have had members who have participated in activities that were not ethical, where those were handled on a one-on-one basis, and those members became members who were no longer in good standing and lost their membership. So there is that, mechanism to be able to challenge bad actors and to get bad actors out of the organization. Most of those are not, well, I'll say all of it is not just for, dark PR or sharing half-truths. It's usually when they have done something that would be a felony or might be under investigation for having broken the law.
Now, I want to turn to the full group here. What we're discussing, again, is disarming disinformation, and there's a number of different routes. We discussed the industry route. We discussed how communicators like Lisa can counter this, and Dipayan, I went to you for legal regulatory. Let's assume that there's not a one-size-fits-all approach. Is there a good place for us to start? Is there a most effective place to start? And I'll open that to the full group here.
Yeah, so what we do with our detection and mitigation, so we're more of an analytics shop than I would say communicators, but we do provide strategy guidance as to how to potentially counter. We let the research drive the solutions, and it really depends on whatever the goal is. So I think a lot of people don't realize the full range of response options that they have, and I think that, while this is an issue, I think that lives best when it's in a communications office within an organization. There are other options as well. If something is potentially policy violating, flag it for the social media platforms to require removal. If you have the forensics to back it up, you can go public with the networks that are actually doing this and expose them. We've seen that be incredibly effective. There's sometimes legal action that can be taken. It really just depends on the situation, and every situation is unique. So for us, it's a question of really making sure that you have the right information in order to be able to make a smart decision, because otherwise, for example, let's say it appears that an account is talking about your company or your organization, and it goes viral, and it could be incredibly damaging to your brand. But what if all of the users are actually all linked and nobody's actually seeing it and it's not gaining any traction? And you with the megaphone think that you have this huge conversation online that you need to deal with, when in fact, if you talk about it, that's when it's going to move over. So being able to detect what's happening, assess its impact, and then mitigate is absolutely critical. It's unfortunate, but this is the digital reality in which we live. And so the question becomes, knowing that this is coming, what is your organization going to do about it?
Lisa, actually, I want to, on your latest point of this can sometimes be contained and we don't even know it. There's a debate right now on whether disinformation stems bottom up or top down. And there's been some interesting reporting saying the latter, that sometimes disinformation can come top down. Do you think that there's one way where disinformation is flowing and doesn't matter? And how do you approach it?
So, I mean, again, it's very situation specific. We see both. I think that there's we're all in the digital world. So like there's a difference between like me tweeting something versus Beyonce tweeting something. Like it's just not even the same scale. So but if there are thousands of me's tweeting something, that could be just as impactful. But it always comes back to what's the goal? Like, what do you actually care about? What's going to get in the way of you being able to reach your customers, your voters, your shareholders, your stakeholders? That's what you need to be thinking about and zeroing in on. And so again, going back to, we let the research drive the mitigation strategy. It just depends on what the research is showing. It depends on, is it a community that you actually care about? Is it that, if it is coming from the top, can you just call the person? Like, it depends on what the situation is.
Now, yeah.
A good point. I was going to say that I noticed in the chat earlier that someone had asked about opinionist, and that kind of goes to what Lisa is talking about there, and the fact that you have to look at, who is that? And certainly today we have, at least loosely said, citizen journalism. Anyone can be a journalist and anyone can be a communicator because they can sit in front of their computer or on their phone or and type whatever they want and say whatever they want and share their opinion. So that also leads into this idea of disinformation, that a lot of what is out there is simply that, is opinion. And people have a hard time discerning the difference between someone's opinion and whether it is fact. And so you do have to look at mitigating that. How deep does that go? Are these thought leaders, are these influencers, as Lisa just said, or is it just someone spinning their opinion and you've got that person and maybe a handful of others who are all of that same opinion? And so you do have to decide as an organization, is it worth responding to that and even saying that it is a problem, because in responding you may make that so much bigger than it needs to be. And so you do have to look at who's sharing that. I will say from the standpoint of what we can do now as communicators, PRSA started last year working on the idea of misinformation, disinformation. We just launched a strategic plan earlier this year. That's our triennial plan for 2021 and 22. And so we're looking at that, misinformation, disinformation. We are looking at civilities in our strategic plan to look at how do we as communicators help to promote a civil discourse instead of where we are now, to where if there's disagreement, there's incivility. So we started presenting panels at our international conference last year on that. This year, we are focusing on trying to educate our members and others in the communication committee. So I do think, to Lisa's point, education is key, and educating people that you have the influence over. And so we've had presentations and podcasts around this topic. We also, as you mentioned, had the infodemic graphic earlier this year, and talking about there is this kind of pandemic infodemic of information going out. We will be coming up on the 26th, October 26th through 29 is our international conference, the PRSA International Conference. This year, the topic of that conference is navigating a world disrupted. So we're looking at it, in part of our subtitle is disinformation, pandemic, and social justice. So looking at where we are right now in the world, that we're seeing so much disinformation, and we are really addressing that head on in our conference, as well as social justice and the social injustice that we are seeing, and the pandemic. So Nina Jankowicz, who is an author and a disinformation expert, is a keynote speaker, and she's going to be talking about this and disinformation and what we can do about it. Laurie Garrett, who's a Pulitzer Prize winning science writer and author that you probably are familiar with, she's going to be talking about COVID-19 and all around that, but mainly, or importantly, talking about the disinformation around COVID-19 and the things that we can do about that. And then our advocacy committee came up with a program that we will be launching later this year. It'll be rolled out to members in December and next year launched. That is an advocacy education program that is based on 4 pillars. And one of those pillars is misinformation, disinformation, malinformation, and how we can filter down information to our members that they will be able to discern better, be able to work in their own communities, wherever they are, to try to make a difference, to try to help in their community. And then one of the pillars is also civility. And we see that having that civil conversation goes a long way to helping address dis, and malinformation.
Thank you, Garland. All right, so we have about 15 minutes left in this conversation, and I want to hit on 2 key components here. One is the regulation and legal point, and then 2, we've got a lot of requests in for specific case studies, and I know Lisa went through Wayfair, but I want to give opportunity for more case studies on combating disinformation. Dipayan, I want to turn to you first. We've talked about how it's very different between opinion, half-truths, misinformation, disinformation. It's very murky, gray area. Politicians on each side want different things when they come to regulation here. Is there a silver bullet that that we can get through for regulations?
Well, I think what we need to recognize is that all this stuff is happening on a couple of platforms. Of course, when I say all, I'm taking a bit of a shortcut, but the vast majority of the social harm resulting from disinformation is happening over the platforms that we all use, not the platforms that only fringe parts of society use. And as such, you know, I think to the other panelists' points, we need to put more pressure on the companies. Whether you're a PR firm working on behalf of your client, whether you are a firm trying to contain a misinformation or disinformation trope against you, whatever be the case, the first thing to do is to reject it. Second is to put immediate pressure using whatever tools possible to contain that story, and to apply pressure on the social media firm, on the company that's responsible for the facilitation of its dissemination. How do you do that? Well, I think again, you have to highlight it. You have to use your tools, including any public figures that you might be able to call on to kind of or your own organization to kind of push back against this, and that will potentially induce the platforms to take action, as we have seen in the context of this presidential election this year, where Facebook is essentially towing a line between Democrats and Republicans with President Trump and the Biden campaign to try to appease both sides. And many of its actions are being defined by essentially the political pressure on the company, the tremendous public sentiment that builds up on both sides. So it is putting pressure is the number one thing you can do, I think, to contain the threat of misinformation. On the regulatory side, you know, what I would suggest is that to that point, to the point of putting pressure on the companies, there are specific kinds of policies that actually people on both sides of the aisle are talking about right now. Reforming Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, for example, is one very good example, where if you take away the liability shield, the blanket liability shield that platforms enjoy over any content that they might have or any censorship that they might undertake, you immediately induce pressure on them to do what's right, to do what's more socially acceptable. And I think there are certain carve-outs from that blanket liability shield that you could think about, right? Like virality, or that's to say you'd carve out viral content, or you'd carve out known disinformation, or presumed misinformation by publicly trusted third parties. There's that. So reform of Section 230 immediately puts that pressure, and I think it's something that is coming, you know. So that is something that will affect all of us in our work, I think. And secondarily, I think there's also a business model that prioritizes engagement at the expense of any kind of democratic interest. And there are changes coming there too, around privacy, around transparency into algorithms, around market competition. We saw this House antitrust report. So I think there are changes that are coming in the medium to long term. And in the meantime, we all have to do whatever we can to push back against tropes, using whatever tools we have to apply political, public pressure on the platforms that are responsible for disseminating lies about our clients, about our own lives, etc.
Lisa, you've testified on the Hill. Your colleague Semiotis is about to in just a few minutes. What do you tell lawmakers?
Yeah, so I think we take a little bit of a different approach, and I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that we're very in the weeds on this issue. You know, identifying threat actors, assessing their impact, that sort of thing. So I'm sure that everybody at the social media platforms would tell you that I'm not their biggest fans, and I do think that this whole self-regulation thing is not working. That being said, I do think there are really good people at the social media platforms, but for all kinds of reasons, that it's not in their business interest to invest the resources necessary in order to actually mitigate this threat. And I don't think that Mark Zuckerberg was sitting in his Harvard dorm room wondering how to build a platform that could potentially threaten the Western liberal order and our economic institutions, but here we are. So that being said, I am very pro-regulation, but I'm pro-smart regulation. You know, some of the things that have been mentioned so far, I think are good ideas, but I think that it would be naive to think that regulating the platforms is the only way that we are going to be able to deal with this. And I actually see that as one part of any solution and any response to a situation. But the idea that we can't go after threat actors, we can't go after for-profit disinformation entities for things like slander, for things like trying to cause a short seller attack. Like, we have laws on the books, and there are things that lawyers can do to sue the entities and the individuals behind them if you're able to get to a point of attribution with a high degree of confidence. I also think that you know, from a messaging standpoint, while I agree that we have seen a blur between news and opinion, I think that that is important and something that we must address and do a better job of distinguishing. I also think that we have to address the fact that right now, bad actors are actively cherry picking facts and disseminating them in order to sway people through, you know, manipulating the algorithmic silos that create the playground that frankly is a digital universe. And so what we need to be doing is looking at this as a whole of society problem. So so the way I think about it, it's how do you increase accurate information? That's obviously through supporting journalism, which has been a struggling industry now for many years. So do we need to rethink the business model of journalism? Do we need to rethink how information is accessed? Should social media platforms be paying journalists to, you know, be paying news entities to have them on their platforms, since they're now a news source for people to get their news? Like, there are all kinds of creative things that we aren't even discussing as part of the conversation. We also are looking at, I think we need to have a serious conversation, and everybody shies away from this, but I promise it's not that complicated, about reforming the algorithms. The same things that communicators are using to be able to disseminate information through a good old-fashioned digital campaign. It's different when it's somebody's Etsy shop versus when it's the Kremlin. So we need to be able to come up with the right safeguards there. And I'm not just talking about paid engagement, I'm talking about organic, because as I'm sure everybody on this call knows, organic is much more valuable than a paid digital strategy. The goal of a paid digital strategy is to build an organic following. And so we need to look at some of those mechanisms as well. And I think we need to look at the financing. So for example, right now there are for-profit disinformation firms that are posting these clickbait articles that, are actually profiting from their Google AdSense accounts. We need the platforms to do a little bit more of knowing your customer the same way we would with any institution that's issuing payments. So I definitely agree that there are a lot of policy solutions to this. I think also there are things that we can collectively do as community members, like reading more skeptically, and also as organizations, like communicating more effectively, in order to be able to mitigate this challenge. But the bad actors know where the lines are, they know where the fault lines are, and they're exploiting them. And so there's a lot that we need to do to address this. I don't think a single bill is going to be the silver bullet.
Lisa, I want to stick with you quickly here. You talked about how for some cases where it's a closed network of people, it's probably better not to respond. Can you talk us through when you do respond, how you respond to disinformation campaign? Case study?
Yeah, so I mean, again, like I don't want to not answer the question, but it just depends on what the situation is. It depends on what the client's goals are. What is their risk appetite? Because as everybody knows, anytime you put out a communication, it's a risk. And so we take that into consideration as we're assessing the goal, as we're doing the various mitigation strategies. But it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. We custom tailor any strategy, any plan to each client, and it all depends on what the data is showing us. So it's really about getting those data-driven solutions to be able to help inform the best step. But I always tell people, if there is something that's policy violating, flag it for the platforms, but I promise you they're not going to come save you from this situation. So we're going to need a plan B, C, and D. And sometimes it's a matter of having plan B, C, and D going all at the same time.
And before we close things out, Garland, is there a case where you had to respond to misinformation and that response helped inform people, change minds?
Just a case in my own day job with the hospital where there was a lot of misinformation around the pandemic and the virus, and whether it was safe to still get medical care and those types of things. So, in the early stages in March, April, May, we had a lot. I'm in pediatric healthcare. We had a lot of parents who were fearful because of the misinformation as to whether they should still take their children for their vaccinations, and whether they should continue treatments for some chronic condition that their child had. So we did have to launch a counter campaign around misinformation that to say that as a pediatric healthcare system, we are still here safely serving and share the safety measures that we had put in place, and information that would arm those parents. And it was a two-pronged approach in being a wide community campaign, but also a targeted campaign as well to those parents to try to, assuage fears, get parents to make sure they were still taking care of their children, and assuring them that we could do it in a safe manner, and dispelling what's rumor, what's misinformation from what is fact. And I will say that by mid-July, we saw volumes returning to normal. We saw parents, beginning to bring their children in. So it does go to show that if you do get the information out there and you can look at the channels and you know the audience that you're speaking to, that you can make a difference and you can help to educate them. One of the things I wanted to mention that PRSA is also doing around education and looking at the digital space, the University of Cambridge, their social decision-making area in the UK has decided to use gamification to help educate. And so they have developed a app called Go Viral that we have signed on to be a supporter of that. The Global Alliance for Communication is a supporter. PRSA, the United Nations, is supporting it, and looking at a way that you can use gamification to help people to understand, and especially younger people and those who are into gaming, to understand specifically how disinformation can be spotted, and to help better educate them on how they can make better decisions and determine whether something is true or it is mis or disinformation. So that's one thing you may want to go out there and look at the University of Cambridge and the game Go Viral, which they're calling a cognitive vaccine against misinformation and specifically COVID-19.
Thank you. Now we're in our last minute. I want to very quickly, if any of you have a final 10, 15 second plug, something that we missed before we close things out.
Yeah, I would just say, having listened to Lisa's prior comments, I think we're in more agreement than disagreement. I think if anything, I think regulating the algorithm is among the most contentious things that social media companies would oppose, and it's essentially the kind of thing that I'm calling for through privacy, transparency, and Section 230 reform. Those are the reforms that would allow you to do that kind of thing. So I think we're in more agreement. And I also think, working against bad actors using existing laws that are on the books is definitely something that people should try. The problem is that, of course, it's a distributed problem, and one that doesn't necessarily scale to the amount of content that appears on platforms like Facebook. Billions of pieces of content, much of it misinformation, disinformation, and I think we'll just kind of continue to be in a bit of a hamster wheel unless we reform the structure of the system as it exists right now itself.
I would say in regard to that, I go on record too saying that I support regulation, and as Lisa said, smart regulation. Of course, healthcare is very highly regulated, if not one of the most regulated businesses, but communication. I mean, if we're thinking about all of the other regulations that dictate whether it's broadcast journalism, print journalism, all communication, where there are regulations, and where we see most of this misinformation, disinformation, malinformation in the digital space is not regulated. And so it's not a level playing field, and it opens up so much opportunity for what we're seeing right now without that regulation.
Struggling to take myself off of mute. So a couple of things. One, I would say, yes, it is this big, scary problem. Yes, there are companies who are doing this. Yes, there are foreign actors who are doing this. That doesn't mean that there's nothing you can do about it. And so I would say, I hope that everybody walks away from this realizing that they can help by not spreading disinformation. And that also includes, not commenting on things that you don't know. Like, for example, I tweet a lot about disinformation in social media companies. You will never see me tweeting about whether or not a vaccine is effective because I have no idea. It's okay to not say something and just to listen and learn in our personal capacities. And then in our professional capacities, there's actually a lot that we can do to empower ourselves to fight back against this. So I would just say, like, yes, it is this enormous problem. And yes, there are things that you can do about it. And, you know, not all of those things are hard. And so I do think that realizing, you know, I think communications professionals especially are now in the crosshairs of a major national security problem, but no one's coming to save any organization, and to be able to have the organization protect itself is probably the smartest thing that any of us can do right now.
Dipayan, Lisa, Garland, thank you so much for sharing your insights and experience countering dark PR. And thank you to all of you in the audience for joining us for this conversation. Please be sure to check the National Press Club website, that's at press.org, to learn how you could join the club if you're not already a member, and learn about the activities and benefits like this amazing conversation that are available to you. Thank you again, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day.